Hello, Dimitri.
Hello, Duncan.
How are you?
I'm good. How are you?
I'm very well. We're back here on Team Gilded Rose,
Yeah.
and we have a refactoring job for today, I think.
Yeah.
So we had this Spring Boot application that we
Yeah.
inherited, and
Oh, yeah.
we need to understand there's some feature needs to be added. I can't remember what, but we're going to
Yeah.
try and understand it. And our approach is going to be to refactor until we understand. I think. Does that sound
Yeah.
sensible?
Yeah.
Right.
I have it already set up. So.
Oh, so you've had a look at it. That's good. Shall I work out how to put it on the screen and then we can crack on? Oh, there we go. Okay, so I can see Gilded Rose application.
Yeah. So I figured out this is the entry point. So it's a Spring Boot app, and this is IntelliJ in presentation mode. You've seen it before, right?
Yeah, IntelliJ I pay lots of good money for.
Oh, okay. This is essentially an entry point, so maybe it's worth renaming to main. That's what I would do. It's like, yeah, it's like a hint that there is a main function. So what it does here, it calls this function called run application and passes GildedRose application in. And then it has this annotation which just wires everything together. So there is no way to use ID navigation to find what's inside the application. I found I can click here, it shows like all the beans created in by Spring, but there are also diagrams. This one is kind of useful. So it doesn't show a relationship between components, but it shows you that there is a web controller which has mapped into /items, and the web controller uses GildedRoseService. Here it's GildedRoseService impl, which uses ItemsRepository impl, loads items basically from a database, and it also uses GildedRose to like process those items. And that's kind of it. This is a bit, I found this a bit confusing, so I made a diagram for you. So overall, there is a client, Firefox. It talks to the web server, which talks to service, which uses repository to load items and uses GildedRose to update those items. So that's
So you've got this running.
Oh yeah, that's a good point. Let's run it just to make sure it still works. So I'll switch to Firefox. I think if I go to this URL /items for date 20, it returns JSON with these 5 items. If I go to
Those are
date,
the magical items from our magical goods store.
yeah, and if I choose a different date, it gives us different set of items. It has authentication as well, but I already logged in. So that's
Okay,
about
so
it.
one route that we saw somewhere in the web controller.
Oh, let me run all tests just to make sure.
Oh, tests.
Yeah, there are good tests and they have good coverage. Took nearly 7 seconds. So it's saying, yeah, there is a web controller.
And so Spring is finding this web controller in some auto magic way, because we didn't reference that in our main in any way, did we? So it's finding this thing and then producing an app that services and route calls through this /items in some clever way.
Yeah, so using ID, there are no usages of this.
Right. That's a little bit strange, but it's still tested then?
Yes. There are tests for web controller and integration tests for the whole app. So, yeah, where do you want to start?
Well, often I find that I can sort of cope with the innermost levels, the things that depend on least things first. So what's the sort of bottom of this then? The Gilded Rose then, maybe.
Yeah.
That seems to be the thing furthest from any sort of magic wiring.
Sorry, that's in domain. So GildedRose. If I do ID search, it actually finds tests for it and where it's injected. So that in this case,
okay,
it works. Would you like test first?
So here we are. We have got a test, and auto wired Gilded Rose. So that's nullable in Kotlin because because we can't give it a value now, can we?
Yeah, it doesn't have to be nullable, but because it's auto-wired.
Oh, I see. Okay. So, but we could make that late in it, and that would solve that problem in a tiny way, wouldn't it?
Yeah. I personally, I think I'll prefer var over nullable. Because the problem with nullable, it's never actually null, and the problem with var that it's never actually changes. So either way, it's not ideal, right?
How would you like to be lied to?
Yeah.
Oh, that's good. I mean, normally we might like to pass this in and construct it, but we can't do that because there's test and JUnit is creating the thing for us. Well, actually, Spring Boot is creating it, I guess.
We actually could. I think it works. Truth be told.
How does that work?
Like that. It is, I think, working. In some ways, it's better. It solved that problem. But
I learned something today. That's good.
Yeah,
so let's have a look at GildedRose. So GildedRose is marked as a service, which must be some way for Spring to identify it as a thing, but it doesn't actually have any dependencies, does it?
No, it's pretty much just a function which modifies items, I think. Yeah.
So if we were to create one of those ourselves in the test, then we wouldn't need to auto-wire, would we?
Yeah. Let me try that. So basically, don't need auto-wire, and we can just instantiate a thing. And then we don't need this annotation.
Before you do, let's just see how quick it is to run with and without Spring. I'm just interested in that.
So it's recompiling now. It was like nearly 3 seconds. But if I run it without recompilation, no changes. 2.6.
So 2.5 seconds. So it's taken Spring 2.5 seconds to wire this thing up, whereas we can actually run it in 600 odd. Yeah, that still seems quite slow, but actually this test is doing quite a bit, isn't it? Because it's iterating over 100 days of things.
Yeah. Oh, well. I'll probably commit it, but I'll use this action from a plugin I wrote. It's commit without dialog. It just commits with the previous commit message. So if we want, we can go later and edit messages. We're not pushing it, so it's all right, I think. Right, so I think since we did GildedRose and tests, to me it would make sense. We instantiated ourselves in tests. It would make sense to me to instantiate it in that other usage, which is inside service impl.
Yes.
So we could just do this, right? And then I'll run all tests. So then we don't need this service here. Yeah, I think it all works. So yeah. This is it, I think.
Okay, so we've extracted a test and we've extracted a domain class. Now have no dependencies on Spring.
Yeah, all this stuff, and that one of the nodes on the edge of the dependency graph. Right?
So it makes sense, I guess, to step up now because we might have broken some dependencies with GildedRose. I'm going to say broken. I mean, like not made to not work, but removed a link to in some sort of way. So we still have, what do we have auto-wired here? We have a repository and the logger. The logger seems like strange to me. How does that actually get instantiated? Because I didn't see anything about logging.
Yes. So what I did before, actually, the way I navigate this code base, I usually click at the type, so like repository, and then I can see there is one implementation and so on. It doesn't work with Logger because it takes me to SLF4J, which is just a Java library. So here we have to rely on Spring. So I cannot really search for usages, it just shows me to it. Oh, actually it does show it here if I constrain to project files. Anyway, the Spring navigation is handy in this case. So it takes me to this function, which I think has called prototype, so it means every time we auto-wire logger, this function is called and it creates the...
So we get a different one every time rather than there just being one in this bean factory thing.
Yeah, I think at service is a singleton, basically.
Right. Well, unless we are making use of the fact that Spring is injecting this for us, that seems to be... just a bit random to me. Can we just call a function to do that thing?
Yeah, I thought we could maybe have a new logger function, right? And that will do what we need, and we could just call this function and create the log ourselves if we need to. In here.
We still need to give it a name though, wouldn't we? And we're not doing that there. So, but if we were to take the name of the enclosing class here, we could do that with a
so some extension function maybe.
Yes.
Like this. So and then we'll call new logger and maybe this Java class, simple name. I'm not sure if it's exactly the same thing, but it will do, I think. So we could say here new logger and maybe run all tests. I think it's like this logger is clearly not tested, I think. But
no, I mean nobody actually tests loggers, do they?
Yeah, and we're not really making it injectable at this point, but we could move it to constructor if we need it. But if it's not tested, maybe it's fine to just leave it like this. Right. Yeah.
So we've removed. So we now only have one auto-wide dependency. Should we try and get rid of that, or should we look in the test for this GildedRose service?
Yes, let's look for tests. So if I search for usages in project, this class is like saying it's not used anywhere. So I can try and navigate to auto-wide, and it's showing only twice for some reason WebController. So basically Spring navigation doesn't really work, and I cannot search for this class. So that's not great. I'm pretty sure though it's instantiated in this test. So it's auto-wide by interface, and it's used here. The other thing I just realized is that it's called impl. I really don't like impls, and I would like to rename it, but I don't really have any ideas. So I'm kind of tempted to get rid of the interface. And
unless we mock it in any sort of way or have other implementations,
no,
there doesn't seem to be any point in having the interface.
It is the only implementation. So I don't know very good refactoring, so just manually shadow it. Basically, I'll deleted the interface and renamed the class. So it's not the cleanest refactoring, but passes the test. I'll commit, and I think the benefit of this, at least I can do ID search and it actually finds the test. So that's the bonus.
So let's see if we can understand this. We have a GildedRose service, and the GildedRose service depends on an item repository now, and that's being mocked here.
Oh, mock being, yeah.
And then, so that's telling Spring that it needs to mock one of these for us and then give it to the GildedRose service.
Yeah, creates a mock and puts it in here.
Okay. If we were to, we could, I guess, create this mock bean ourselves in some sort of way.
We could even just create this class, right? All it needs is ItemsRepository, but we already have it in the test. We could try and just create.
Oh, see, yes.
Create this, right? So something like
that. Oh, yes,
that,
because Spring is auto-wiring the mock bean for us. That makes sense to me.
Yeah.
That hasn't worked, and okay, yes, because we're creating the service and then the mock bean is being in.
Right. Oh, it's letting it, so it's still now. Right?
Yes,
we see it before it's created. So I think there is this lazy thing which might help. Basically, we also delay the creation of service. So yeah, this worked basically. The test.
Okay, so that's a nice way of solving this. Late init things are created afterwards. I mean, what it means is really that our service is now being created on first use, but remembered. Yeah. But I still rather not. It's still quite a slow test because we've got all this Spring Boot testing going on. Could we just mock the item repository ourselves?
Oh yeah, I think we could just instantiate it ourselves, right? As well, because I think it's a Makito mock, so we could just create it like this and pass in. The only reason it was using annotation, we could do it normal property now, I think. The only reason it was using annotation because it needed to know how to inject it, I think. So yeah, this works.
So it needs to remember it in order because it's then going to create the GildedRose service for us. But now we're creating the GildedRose service. We don't have to have Spring do the mocking for us. And then, yes, as you've done, we don't need to be a Spring Boot test.
Yeah, and it went down from 2.7 roughly seconds to 1 without the annotation. If I run it twice, it excludes compilation, so it's like literally once, like more than 2 times faster.
I like more than 2 times faster.
Yeah, so I committed that.
That looks like a good place to commit.
Maybe similar to the, so we now instantiate service ourselves in the test. We should probably do the same in the controller just for symmetry, so that we're testing the same dependency graph. Right, so here what we want really is to construct it ourselves, but we need ItemsRepository, which sorry, just to maybe open this thing diagram. So we fixed GildedRose is outside of Spring. We're looking at the service, but it depends on repository. So that's what we're trying to figure out. And repository also has an impl, it has JDBC, also logger. So,
so that's the place where we were mocking it. We are mocking it, so the interface is useful to us. Right. In this case.
Oh yeah. What I was thinking, like, it would be nice to be able to construct, but like ItemsRepository is another rabbit hole. So
yes, but we could ask Spring to provide the item repository, and then we could create the GildedRose service here.
Oh, I see. So you mean auto-wire, like push the auto-wiring into WebController?
Yes.
So we can just pass it here, then we don't need to auto-wire the service, and this is not required. I'll just make all these changes and see if it works. This is pretty cool. It does work.
So that's pulled GildedRose service out of the clutches of Spring. I mean, we're still using Spring to do the wiring, but we just changed the level at which it is wiring.
Yeah. So I guess we're done with the service then.
I mean, that GildedRose service could come out of the constructor there, couldn't it? I guess, and then we'd.
Oh, you mean in WebController?
Yeah.
We could, yeah. We don't need the type then. I could make it private. Yeah, it works. I committed it. I think it's complaining not final, but I think if it's private, it should, yeah.
Oh, that's fine. Yes.
Should we look at ItemsRepository then?
I think we should.
So once again, it's an interface with one impl implementation. Maybe it could be called DB, I think, because I can imagine like in-memory ItemsRepository. What do you think?
It's nicer than impl. Okay. I hate me impl.
Yeah, so I'll commit this. So
now I can see a low-hanging fruit of that logger. We know what to do with those.
Oh, yeah. Just let's say new logger. I'll just run tests. Yeah. And it has JDBC template, which is late in its var. So we could move it to the constructor.
That has worked well for us. Let's do that.
So in the constructor, it cannot be.
So I understand that in fact you don't need to mark constructor parameters auto-wide at all.
Okay. So we can try this. Yeah, it works. Cool.
So that auto wiring is required for parameter for properties fields, but doesn't seem to be required for constructor parameters, which is handy.
Yeah. So tidy up. Yeah.
So this is now sort of extracted from Spring, apart from this repository annotation, which is required, I guess. What does its test look like?
Yeah, so I'll try the same thing. If I use ID, it still shows no usages. So that's disappointing. And if I use Spring, it says navigates me to WebController, but not to the test. So it's also a bit disappointing. But I know there is a DB items repository test, which auto-wires items repository.
Yes, but you're looking for the DB version, not the
But if I navigate to like auto-wired candidates from there, then it shows me DBs. It's just broken navigation. Yeah. Anyway, what do we have here? We have auto-wired repository, which becomes DB repository. And we have JDBC template.
So we know the items repository requires the JDBC template, and the JDBC template is just a wrapper around a data source, really, that sort of makes it look.
Oh, yeah, it's also Spring, right? But it's like a wrapper around the JDBC API. Yeah, we could actually construct items repository here, right? Because it needs JDBC, and we could just do this. So I don't need, like, it should be var, val, doesn't need type, and could be lazy, like we've seen.
Yeah, that's it. We had the same problems we had before, but that's...
Yeah, it works. This is progress.
Okay, we are still a Spring Boot test, though, and we need to know how to create a JDBC template.
Yeah, and it's not mocked, so we'll have to maybe put a breakpoint just to see what it really is, and then I'll debug it. And I think we can create JDBC template ourselves. It's just worth knowing what kind of data source it uses. So here's Hikari data source, and it uses this URL, which is H2 in memory database. So I think we can construct them ourselves easily. Should I give it a go?
Give it a go.
Okay. So it doesn't need to be auto-wired. Could be val, and we could just create it, but it needs Hikari data source, which needs Hikari config, which will have URL, like this. So I believe this should work. I think the way it works in Spring is that it looks at this annotation, the test pass, by the way. Spring looks at this annotation and picks up properties from application-test properties. This is where the URL is coming from, really, in Spring.
Right.
So we kind of copy-pasted it into here, so it's like, should be a to-do, read from file. But yeah, it works, so that's good. Let's maybe run all tests.
In your own time, IntelliJ.
Oh, yeah, oh wow, it's failing. That's why it's so slow, like slow timeouts.
Okay, so the WebController integration test is now failing with invalid SQL authorization exception. That's strange because we haven't touched the DB items repository. We haven't touched the WebController integration test.
No.
Can we run the WebController integration test?
Sure. Oh, it works. It works on its own. Doesn't work with the other tests. So there must be some mutable data shared between the two tests somewhere.
That's fun. I think we should probably, there should be this like cutscene of us scratching our heads for a long time and then coming back and saying, oh, now I realize what the problem is. So now we've scratched our heads for 15 minutes trying to work out what the problem. What is the problem, Dimitri?
I think what happens is that if we look at the debug again, we'll see that our tests pick up username and password from production config, which sounds a bit scary. So here I didn't notice the first time, but now I do notice. What am I running? It's a data source. Oh, username and password are null, but when we run it in WebController test, they will be from Postgres. So this is the data source, username, password, Postgres, which are the names from a different property file from production where we do have username and password. So
okay, so Spring has configured our data source, and it's configured it from a combination of our application properties and our application test properties. It's read both of them.
Yes. So
Right.
when we created manually here, we didn't specify username or password, so they're empty. And I think H2, the first time you access it, it just remembers, it accepts any username, any password, and thinks this is the user. And anyone else is not permitted to access H2. So first time we run with no username, no password, H2 is happy. Second time we run it with our production password, and H2 says, I don't know who that user is. So yeah,
that's a real subtlety that it amazes me it only took us that 15 seconds to work it out.
Yeah.
But you could solve your problem simply by putting a username and password into application test properties, could you? Or
yeah, I think I would prefer that. Just put some username here, like I say, and maybe empty password, and put the same thing in here. Username, which matches the properties, and password, which are also matching, and that should work now. We still need to read it from the file, but at least this.
also definitely apply.
Apply, okay. Okay, I'll commit this because we suffered enough, I think.
Well, all tests pass.
Oh wait, we don't need this anymore, right? So
oh yes.
So it should still work.
Brilliant. Oh, and now your repository doesn't need to be lazy, I guess.
Oh yeah, thank you. And then, yeah, I'll commit this. Then, does it need to be repository? Oh, yeah. Oh, wait. I mean, does it need this annotation? I think it still does, because it's auto-wired in WebController. So we moved DB items repository out of Spring in our test, but not in production. And that's like a symmetry of how it's constructed, which I don't necessarily like.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, the other thing I actually just realized here, what we're doing, we're creating a data source. So let me refactor this a little bit. Maybe like I moved data source into its own field. I think data source, it's Hikari, it starts a thread pool, so we should really shut it down, like close at the end. That's what was Spring probably doing for us.
So Spring, yes, Spring was looking after us in a way that we now realize that maybe we should have been a bit more fastidious.
Yeah.
So this DB items repository seems a little bit strange to me. Then, if we look at it, that we are that it requires JDBC. That seems to be a Spring class about its implementation more than.
So this thing is used both in tests and we pass it in.
Yes.
Yeah, I think like if I think about repository, it actually data source maybe is a better abstraction for the repository.
Yes.
These should be read from file. Just I'll correct this. So yeah, maybe I don't know. Good refactoring. I think I tried, but I'll just do it in this kind of nasty way of just changing code. So it's going to be JDBC, and then this will be a data source.
So we're asking Spring to wire up the data source for us, and then we'll create a template.
Okay, so we could now in controller create maybe repository, the items repository, but it needs data source, which we could auto-wire. Oh, made too many steps, I suppose. Let's hope it works. So this is a data source, which we pass in, and which we use to create JDBC templates. And this is what we have in tests as well. So hopefully it works.
So they're now a bit more alike, aren't they?
Yeah, it all works. I'll commit it. I know it's not perfect yet. So I think I noticed these things are not required anymore, so it could be just an argument, not a property.
Yeah. So now the items repository takes a JDBC class rather than a Spring class, and then it delegates to some Spring, the JDBC template, but that's an implementation detail rather than a detail that it's whoever constructs it needs to know.
Yeah, and I think the other thing was here, it also doesn't have to be a property. I think this is, so now DB items repository basically constructed in both tests and code. So we moved our items repository out of Spring as well. And the navigation works. Like when I search for these usages, it shows me exactly 2 usages and they're both correct, which is handy, I think. Right. So maybe I'll go back to the diagram. What we did GildedRose, then we did the service, and now we just finished repository.
So there's only the web controller left, and we have tests for that somewhere.
Yeah. So there is web controller test and integration test.
Pick one.
Okay. Let's look at these tests.
Wrong one. Oh no, it's okay.
Well, it's interesting that this test is just, it doesn't mention web controller like directly.
Oh, it doesn't. No, that's interesting.
Mock MVC, so it's I think it creates an imaginary web server.
Oh, okay. So that's weird. So Spring knows that Spring knows it's creating a test, and we've said auto configure mock MVC. So it says, well, I'm going to go and try and find a web controller somewhere with some roots, and I'll instantiate that somehow. Yeah, and then I'll wire up to it.
Must be annotation based or something. Oh, I opened the wrong thing. Web controller. REST controller somehow must be picked up, right? That's what you mean.
Yeah. If we go back to the test, I'm interested sort of. No. So we could mock MVC, maybe. No, we can't. No. So mock MVC isn't really. So that's not a mock. That's not a mock like we think of that records things. That's a mock. That's a way of interacting with. It's like a facade on our app, isn't it? Really, that MVC. And then we've got the items repository, which is being mocked and then injected into a web controller we're not seeing at all.
Yeah, this is interesting. So I guess we thought we were constructing it, but actually it's injected in tests, but not maybe injected in production. So it's interesting.
Oh, yes, because that items repository, no, I don't understand that wiring at all then.
Yeah, so we can experiment if we move it here. In my understanding, it's like it should fail because this is mocked. It won't be able to mock anymore. But this was a bit confusing because, yeah, it fails now. And it says, well, something.
Okay, so Spring needs to be able to create everything in order to wire up anything almost.
Yeah.
And we've broken its model of there's just this soup and then I'll pick bits out of it and coming out with the bits I want. Everything will be joined up, like dragging rubbish out the bottom of a lake.
Okay.
I'm
not going to ask why you have this analogy.
I discovered about magnet fishing just the other day. So we're stuck here, I think, because we don't have a test that we have a test here where Spring, in order to run this test, requires to be able to inject and mess around inside objects, and we can't remove this test from Spring because we never create a web controller.
Yeah, maybe there is a way. Just seems quite hard creating a web controller. There is a similar test, but it's integration test. the one that was failing earlier. I think this might be a better place, but maybe we should just rewrite WebController at this point. It's like, why are
So
we
this
making
is a
ourselves?
test then that actually runs, because it says random port, that actually runs up a web server. So I guess it's going to be probably slower than the other one, but is actually running up a web server, and then has a JDBC template that is being used to populate database in all of the things. And then this REST template, which is being used to talk via, it's effectively an HTTP client, isn't it, by the look of things? So saying REST with basic auth and so on.
Oh, yeah.
Okay, so REST is just an abstraction over HTTP, and then, but we still not in a position here to create a web controller because Spring does it for us, and it needs to wire everything up. We haven't even got a constructor for it, really, have we?
Yeah.
We don't know how to create a server around it. That's Spring Boot's job.
Yeah, sounds like we need another break.
Yes, if we had another break, and if I went to lunch, then you could probably work out how to write the equivalent of the web controller in a framework where we were able to actually construct the objects ourselves.
Yeah.
Maybe a library rather than a framework, but something that was really designed to be testable. Do you know any HTTP libraries like that?
Yeah. Let me commit what we have because it works. And yeah, first of all, maybe I would fix the to-do that we had. So I quickly typed this, as you can see. So what this is doing is basically I enhanced the config object, which Spring was loading via annotation, but now I added some code which can just load it from property files directly based on the env parameter, which is passed in. So we can now fix this to do. That would be nice. So
okay, so all that config was you rewriting the bits of Spring, well, rewriting, but implementing the bits of Spring that read from the class path.
Yes. So now we can write something like that, and this will give us a data source basically with the same config. So let me run the test. Yeah, this works. So it does the same thing. And that's one improvement. So good to fix it to do before it's a couple years. So this thing we want to be a Spring, and then I'll quickly write another thing, another web controller, which is written in HTTP4K. And it's just a class which implements this type ls HTTP handler. So it really is type ls for a function which takes a mutable request and returns a mutable response. So quite straightforward. And this function on invoke, it invokes roots, it gets the request in, and yeah.
Maybe we'll have a look at it later and try and work out how it works and compare it to the Spring version. But can you prove that it works?
Yeah.
I mean, can we actually put that in place of the Spring version somehow?
Yeah, we have this integration test. Maybe we could do it here. So in the first place, we want to get rid of these auto-wide things, right? Maybe we could construct this thing ourselves. So test REST template, which is a REST client, well, HTTP client. It fails because of the random port, but if we do defined port, it should work.
Okay, so just tease down a little bit of Spring, but we're still talking to the Spring web controller now, right?
Yes, just doing one step at a time. So then we don't want to construct JDBC template. Actually, we just had it here, right? As data source, going to be the same. So now we got our JDBC template out of Spring. We're still testing Spring controller though, because it's a Spring Boot test, and it starts a web server. So then we want to write our own server. So I'll define a server here. So it was web controller class, and it takes a config, which we have here. So I can have config and just pass it in. think it wants to be private. Then we have GildedRoseService, which we know how we can construct. Then it needs DB ItemsRepository, which we can construct, which needs data source, which we just have here. That's all kind of interesting. And as I showed, WebController was just a function, really. So if we want a web server running, we need to tell HTTPK, this is the library I used, to plug it into Undertow. And for that, I'll use config port. Actually, we should be using config port here as well. I think so. Now we can start the server. And we should stop the server. So at this point, we could delete the annotations. Otherwise, there will be port clash. So I claim, oh yeah, it does work, and works much faster.
So
yeah.
So we've had to work out how to wire these objects. I mean, we already knew because we'd been wiring them in our lower level tests, but we are actually now masters of our own destiny because we have created the web controller ourselves, and then we have started used that, whatever it is, and we said as server, and then that we started that server and we stopped the server. So it's been a lot quicker, I guess, to start. Are we sure? How do we use that in production? Maybe.
Right. Yeah. Maybe we could extract most of these things. I'll just refactor it and test first.
Mm-hmm.
So maybe I'll call it class app and paste everything in. I don't think we need REST, and we don't need JDBC, which we use for testing. And other than that, we could just reuse essentially these functions. Well, not the most elegant way, but we want this, maybe call it start, and we want this as stop. We also should probably shut down data source, like do close. And that's the app, which we could construct here, I think. I could say app and then construct. Well, one missing thing is that we want to configure the environment, right? Because we start app in different environments. So here it's going to be a test, which is what we need. And then we could replace it with, could replace server with the app. So let's see if that works. Yeah, it does. And then we don't need server. We also, the config app has it already, right? We just can make it public, and data source is also in the app. This is just purely refactoring to kind of.
And those are just required because we need to know where the app is running in order to then interact with it, aren't they?
Yes. So it still passes, which is nice.
Nice.
And yeah, this, I think it's a bit like a fixture really as well. And then maybe I'll refactor this just to extract a few things. Repository, service, and so on. So these two can be private. And so this is, I think, the whole wiring, really. That's all we needed. So we move it to main, I think. And this way we can know that we are, like, if we can plug this now into main function, and then we will know that we're testing the same thing. Right, so here we just say prod, and we start it. We'll need to shut it down, to be fair. But yeah, that's kind of the whole thing. I can even like try and run it for real. I think it starts faster now. So yeah, if I refresh manual testing, so yeah, still looks quite okay. It's a quick check.
So we're still using the Spring integration test, which was actually talking HTTP, and whereas Spring was this soup of objects that were brought into existence by class bus scanning and so on. Though that soup is now, in fact, contained by our app. We're saying that these are the roots. These are the roots. This is how it's configured. We've done all these things ourselves. We were explicit.
Yeah.
But we've had to do it ourselves. We've had to understand that we've had to create a server and know how to start it, know how to stop it, and so on. But we are masters of our own destiny, and that's meant that things have been quite a bit more testable because we haven't had to ask Spring to test them for us to create them. If we want to wire things up, we are able to do that ourselves. I'm interested in WebController then and comparing it maybe to the Spring version.
Yeah.
Oh, well, I see. Right there on line 32, we could be doing better, couldn't we?
Oh yeah, could just do a new logger. Yeah, well, the whole thing of logger is a bit questionable. I would prefer structured login, really. And yeah, but that's maybe a separate improvement.
So I'm interested in this auth filter because we're doing authorization. We know we are because the test required it. The test showed there was a test there, I think, that showed what happened when you logged in, were logged in, and we weren't. Here we're explicitly saying there is this filter that's applied to our routes. You can see it there on line 36. But where was that code in Spring?
It was this web security config, which
Oh,
was
okay.
also had also hard-coded passwords, so very secret. But yeah, it's.
But it's interesting that was there and found, but we didn't know it was there. It's so it was automatically applied because of this @enable web security, I suppose. If that hadn't been there, then Spring wouldn't be.
Yeah, probably
wouldn't be applying security, which is both very clever, but at the same time very hard to know for certain that you're applying security or not. You have to know that everything is being wired up. I have to understand enough about Spring. Okay.
Yeah, imagine with this annotation, it starts looking for this function which creates a bin somewhere, and then it calls this function which creates another bin. So
I see. And so that's not even by actual type. It's just by methods that return the right type of thing, I suppose.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah.
Okay.
Well, yeah, I guess it's a bit like a plugin system. There is this interface, security filter chain. So
whoever wrote this must have read the manual, I think.
Yeah. It's like you cannot navigate to it within project at all. And here it's very clear link auth filter is just here. Yeah.
And then looking at what we actually do, we say there's a filter which applies security, and then something around catch lens failures that I don't understand.
It's built in HTTP.
Quite frankly, mind-boggling. So we'll skip over that.
Yeah.
And then we're saying we've got items, which is the equivalent of the /items in our.
I think the interesting thing is that the roots is also HTTP handler, so all our roots is also a function. And inside here, all we're doing here is we create another function. So everything is like composite design pattern.
You're just composing functions. Whereas Spring is decorating methods with annotations, and then magical things are happening because of those annotations.
Yeah, this is like parameter name based on, path name based on parameter name. Reflective thing.
Yes, I think. Although it's a long time since I've done Spring, so I think I would have to read the manual. But to be fair, I'd have to read the manual for HTTP as well. I'm interested that nowhere in the Spring Web Controller version did we talk about JSON, yet we were getting JSON back. Yeah. So that, I suppose, is because we're a REST controller, we are automatically returning JSON. This list of items on line 69 has been marshaled automatically for us. Where's that happening in the HTTP version?
So we call the service, we get items back, and this is the list, and we're using body lens, which is that thing, which is a function which converts objects into JSON. Okay,
so we're explicitly doing that, and it's setting the content type for us, I suppose, and other clever things.
Yeah, in theory, like nothing would stop you from writing your own code, which checks the object type and applies one of those lenses. So, you could centralize it in there, but yeah, it will be explicit.
Well, I think I choose not to learn any more about HTTP4K at the moment, except to say that I don't think it does everything that Spring does in this case. For example, I'm sure that Spring has health endpoints that we are not using or testing and so on that we would have to implement in HTTP4K. That certainly Spring, in my experience, makes lots of decisions for me. Spring Boot sort of like creates large amounts of facilities that I might have to understand how to do in HTTP4K. But on the other hand, I can see how this is wired up, and our tests are running a lot quicker, which I do like.
Yeah. Do you mind if I delete Spring or kind of finish it just for,
Go on then.
to be safe? So, so we have the web controller, which we don't need anymore. And I think the interesting thing will be, after deleting it, this test still compiles, but we know it's not going to work because it just removed the web controller completely. That will be.
I see. Yes, because we're not explicitly doing it. We never find out that the thing can't be wired up until we try and run it.
I think I'll delete it, but like if we wanted, we could write an in-memory test for our web controller because it's literally a function. So we don't need we don't need mock web MVC or anything because it's a function. We can just call it. But I think I'll just skip it. We have integration tests, which are good enough. And then we have the app, which we don't need anymore. We don't need this annotation, so Spring can go from here. Then we have security config, which is a lot of stuff. Can go. And there was also local date converter, which we didn't look at because we're using local date from Kotlin X. Yeah, so Spring didn't know how to convert this, so can delete that. And there was a login config, which can also be removed. It's a lot of stuff. I'll just run all tests.
When things are being...
It did work, surprisingly.
When things are being automatically created for us, it's hard to know when they're not required anymore. They have to be there somewhere. But I guess IntelliJ can't tell you this is unused because it doesn't know when it might be used or might not be used by Spring. I suppose the plugin has to work hard in order to work out what is and isn't unused.
Yeah. So I'll move these loggers as well into main just to delete a file. I think it should work still. So that's Spring gone essentially. Yeah. This whole thing is not complete. We probably should migrate properties to something else and so on. But yeah, this is it.
So I'm exhausted. Maybe we should have a little think about what we've done, and then I can have a lie down.
Yeah.
So we hard-coded dependencies that didn't need to be varied. What was that about? Oh, so we discovered that there were things that didn't have were injected but didn't need to be.
Like
and
right,
or loggers, for
GildedRose
example,
class, which was really just a couple functions, so it could be even refactored to functions if we tried hard enough.
So removing those allowed us to see where we did and didn't need actual dependencies.
Mm-hmm.
Moving unnecessary interfaces, that was handy. And again, interfaces tell us where we want to have different implementations of things, and if we don't actually have different implementations of them, I think removing unnecessary interfaces was good. And then there were some sort of strategies around how to deal with injected things. So we found nullable we didn't like, late init we didn't like either, but we could replace nullable things with late init, and that meant that we didn't have to deal with them being null everywhere. And then if we made things constructor parameters, then we didn't have to use late init, and lazy properties allowed us to work with things that were injected, work with things that we created that depended on things that have been injected. And there were strategies for using Kotlin to work with lazy property, with injected dependencies for Spring.
I'm personally just surprised how people can tolerate so many nullable and lazy init, not lazy, late init things. So yeah.
Tidy first was I think probably a good way of describing most of the things on that previous slide. It was just looking at things that stood out to us as not normal and trying to fix them.
Yeah, I think it also leads in interesting directions. Like we were trying to make things not nullable and end up thinking, oh, why don't we instantiate things and then tests run faster? So this kind of tidying can give you lots of good ideas.
Certainly, removing Spring from tests allowed us to know what was being created at the very least in our tests, and then we had tests that ran quicker. That was nice. And then starting from the edges of the dependency graph, that was my idea for take the thing that really can't depend on anything else because it's right down the bottom of our code. It depends on nothing. And then work our way towards the roots of our application, trying to hardwire things as far as we could.
What did you learn? Well, I learned that Sprint support is quite confusing. It's not really replacing normal Kotlin navigation. So, yeah.
I mean, I hear that people like it, and they must be used to it.
Yeah, well, it's okay when you write the code and it's a small project like this one where you can remember everything. But if it's like, another like 15 people writing this code for 5 years and you're the new person, so it can be really tough.
We left Spring in places, didn't we? We had the JDBC template. That was quite fine. The REST template was it that we were using to actually test our app in the end. That might not have lived very long, but it was okay. That was fine.
Yeah. Yeah, Spring has like integration with lots of technologies, and I think they find it useful.
The thing that I sort of take out of it though is that I was never sure how objects were wired. There were several times in this where we made a refactor that we thought would be safe, and just our expectations were dashed, and sometimes in quite complicated ways. That H2 problem with the passwords was just really strange, and probably wouldn't have come up had we been wiring things ourselves from the beginning.
Yeah.
You were looking at composition models, and then you were talking about how HTTP is just really composing functions. You have a function and you decorate it with another function, and you sort of compose that with other things.
Yeah, I think it's like what we looked at the security, right? In Spring, you have to have an annotation which lets you create a bean from that configuration of a certain type. So it's more like a plugin model when you have interface, and a separate job potentially provides you implementation of that interface. And then good luck debugging this, especially on a like small project. Like, is it really worth it? I'm not sure. So with HTTP, the information we had is just everything is a function calling a function. To be fair, this can also be made quite complex, but at least more you can step in ID a bit more easily.
Yes, I certainly find there are times with HTTP where working out what function it is I'm actually calling, where that breakpoint will be, is complicated. But we are masters of our own destiny to some extent. We did actually do the wiring ourselves rather than finding that because we'd marked a bean with some annotation, some other annotated method on it was being called and used to inject a thing into some other place.
Yeah. I think it's also interesting that there is, I think, maybe the argument that Spring is more useful on bigger projects. And, when you're saying we were not sure how objects were actually wired, it's like, I imagine on a bigger project, it will be just like a bigger confusion. So I don't see how that argument really works. So,
I feel that pain.
Yeah, I imagine it will be easier to just wire a random thing with any other random thing. That will be easier, but not easier for understanding, like getting a good design.
Next slide, please. So we achieved some things. Things were faster. We got faster feedback from the tests, and we were able to navigate around because IntelliJ really knew what was being used where, as opposed because the Spring plugin, it seems, wasn't always clear. Maybe we're just driving it badly. But then coming back to the thing you said last, I think when we're forced to wire up an application ourselves, we have to think about what should be able to talk to what. Whereas if we pile everything into a pot of dependencies, then it's very easy to have things wired at the wrong level, talking to the wrong things, which leads back to this sort of big ball of mud thing.
Yeah. So these are the references. So what we were doing is basically on this Git, in this Git repository, GitHub, and it's all based on the GildedRose refactoring cutter, which is like a smaller version, just one class. And yeah, if you want to see more Duncan content based on GildedRose, there is a channel on YouTube, and there is also a book Duncan wrote, which you should buy.
And do we have any references at the end of this? I can't remember.
That's it.
Woohoo! Oh, I liked finishing on that slide. That's the best slide ever. You realize that's a color picture, don't you? O'Reilly pushed the book out, and they produced a color picture of a black and white animal.
Okay. Wow, I didn't know that. So it's a color picture of a black and white animal. Yeah, maybe the eye is a little bit more green than like the rest.
Shall we stop there?
Yeah.
I mean, maybe even 5 minutes ago.